at a moment's notice, because you're talking to your friend and doing something and like you'd be using slang or swearing or whatever it is, and the minute the head walks down the corridor, you're going to switch, right? And the way you speak to your nan versus the way you speak to your friends versus the way you speak to your teacher, these are three different codes, and they're already really good at that, and empowering them to understand that, you know, swear words are there for a reason. They're inappropriate in lots of contexts, but actually some of those words are very helpful at extreme moments, and they express our feelings more accurately than where you're not to use said swear words. But it's the same with slang, and it's really important that they understand that these are options. You know, my granddad spoke patois, he was from St Kitts and came here on the Windrush, and what's really important, like I always use that as an example for my students, like there are rules in patois. It's not just like making it up. It's not just because you can't speak or something. There are definite rules. And when poets write in patois, you have definite rules. You know, John Agard used Dem tell me in one of the GCSE set poems. They tell me, but it could be they told me or they are telling me, because there is no definite tense in those verbs in patois. He's doing it on purpose. And so there are rules, and there are different kind of frameworks in all of these different codes in English. And I think it's a really powerful thing to teach children about that. You know, but yeah.
Can I ask, I mean, prompted by that, can I ask maybe Bass or Deborah, the best people to answer, or yeah, Devyani, maybe you too. But I mean, the presumption seems to be a bit, I'm hearing, that slang originates with young people. That's where it comes from. Is that true? Is that, I mean, has that been studied? Has that been worked out?
Does it all studied?
Yes.
And you know, a lot. Slang certainly is generationally associated with it and is a way of differentiating yourself. But I mean, there is nothing so old-fashioned as the last generation's slang.
Yes.
You know, people of my generation, born at the end of the 1950s, are not going to use all that. We were a bit too young for the hippie era, and we just laughed at their slang. You know, groovy and copacetic.
Cool, but everybody says cool.
Cool, kind of cool.
Everybody
slang
says
has
cool.
elastic boundaries, doesn't it? I mean, the things people have talked about. So Bass, for instance, talked about the change in punctuation, whereby, you know, basically a period isn't needed anymore for when you're texting.
Yeah.
Because just pressing send basically tells you that the thing is finished. So it's been repurposed to express irritation, and people say to their parents, "Oh, for God's sake, please don't do it, it makes you sound so angry." And, you know, on the other hand, the exclamation mark is just a softener rather than, this is incredibly exciting. And that's used in, I mean, I love all that kind of thing. I love quotative like and use it, so I'm like this. Would you think it was confusing to use a term like multiplication or valency?
Valency, that was always the one that got me.
No.
Or for that matter, when you're talking about history, nobody says, what the hell is a parliament? Why do kids need to learn parliament or voting? Nobody asks that for history, but somehow for linguistics and language studies, people do ask the question, why do kids need to learn about grammatical terms?
Well, why do they need to learn that meta-language?
Yes.
Every subject has a meta-language, and I don't actually see how you can talk about grammar if you don't have some grammatical terms. I mean, I'm not in favour of making them up just for the sake of it, or teaching them without context either. But I just don't get this fixation on, the meta-language makes it confusing. Because, as I say, nobody would teach maths without using, I mean, they might use different concepts with different terms for very, very young children. They might say taking away rather than subtracting, but it's still a meta-language, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with you. The thing is that I'm from Argentina. I'm a teacher of English as a foreign language at a bilingual school there, English-Spanish bilingual school, secondary school, and I've been told sometimes, well, don't use too much meta-language, don't tell them that you're teaching them how to use a reduced relative clause, just teach them how to use it, but don't use too much or too many names or technical names, because that might be confusing for them that secondary school students. And they themselves sometimes tell me, Miss, why is that we need to learn this or that, the technical term? I need to know how to use it in that state. So sometimes I feel myself confronted by these controversial issues.
I have some sympathy with your question, because teaching anything complicated really well is hard. And I think that there's also a lack of understanding sometimes, certainly in my profession, from my experience of my own teaching over time, about what knowing something actually means. And so there's a difference between being able to rattle off a definition that you have learned of, let's say, relative clause, and actually knowing that beyond that, right? So can they define it? Maybe. Could they spot it if you said, here are 4 things, which one's a relative clause? That's a slightly different skill, but they've still been given some options. Could they spot it in the wild without being prompted? So would they see one and go, ooh, that's a relative clause? Can they spot it in the wild and describe what it's doing? Can they explain how that thing there is similar to a relative clause but different? Like there's a distinction between the two, even though they're closely overlapping or linked. Could they explain how relative clause belongs to another group of terms that are actually, again, similar and belong to a particular category or something? Could they use a relative clause themselves accurately? Could they use it accurately, really well, with a bit of taste for a particular purpose? And so there's a difference between kind of knowing and really knowing. And I think that when we get students asking us questions like, why do I need to know this? My kind of thought is always going to be about, right, let's almost look at knowledge being like a scale. And as a teacher, I'm not satisfied if they're only at the kind of thin end of that scale. What I need to do is make sure that I'm sequencing my curriculum and my learning kind of intention for those children so that they're going from that thin end all the way through here, because when they get here, that knowledge is theirs for life. If they stop here, then it's just going to drop away really quickly. And I think going back to the question we asked about curriculum earlier, what does a great grammar curriculum look like? It's one that has enough intelligent decision making so that you have fewer terms, but the ones you are using, you have enough time to teach really well. Because if we have an over-bloated curriculum with too much stuff in it, then actually what we end up doing is teaching lots of things really badly and everything just disappears. It's kind of this transient stuff. But if you teach some really core stuff very well and they feel really confident and they emerge from our kind of school with confidence, then they could go on to further study and learn the extra stuff better, but they'll have a stronger foundation. So it's about that. What do we mean by knowing it and making sure we're going further? I think.
Devyani.
Just a quick question. Did you say you're teaching bilinguals or teaching second language
Yes.
speakers? Because I think it's really important to distinguish language teaching from grammar teaching. So I'm completely with you. I think for language teaching, it's not always helpful to be labeling and learning language.
Yeah,
I think
that's
you have a very good point there, where like some of what we're talking about is teaching sometimes, often monolingual native English-speaking kids grammar and what is the grammatical. There's a basic labeling that the curriculum is requiring. But I think what you're talking about, I can see exactly what you mean, that any of us who've learned a foreign language, it didn't have to also be labeling. It's hard enough to be using the language and learning, just through practice and production, but labeling would be limited in that.
Yeah, exactly. I was referring to teaching grammar as part of a language class. Yes, exactly.
Can I add something, a quick point about this? Because I think it's to do with the fact that grammar wasn't in the curriculum for so long. So in the UK, lots of teachers aren't that confident with grammar and would maybe say, "Oh, it sounds right, so that's how we know it's right," and not go into detail. And there was some interesting research, I think it was Hill, I'm pretty sure, and they interviewed some English teachers, and these English teachers, like we saw in this report, expressed criticism about the terminology in the grammar curriculum and said, why do children need to know determinate and adverbial? But those same teachers, because as I mentioned before, they tend to be literature graduates, would say, caesura onomatopoeia, of course you should.
Would more opportunities for well-structured talk in the classroom, explicitly modelling and teaching, then utilising complex grammatical structures, be beneficial? Shahan, do you want to start?
So I think in terms of spoken language, the EFL, and I used to be teaching in the EFL many years ago, they do quite a good job. Similarly, if you've done French, Spanish, German in English schools, you would have been exposed to a lot of cassettes or tapes back in the days where the tape recorder would be played. However, it seems to be almost non-existent in primary Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 and beyond. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Again, what Luke was saying is a missed opportunity rather, where we're not utilising teaching children about social linguistics. And when we say grammar, we're not only referring to the grammatical rules of accuracy and getting your tenses right. There's other aspects around etiquette, pragmatic, social linguistics, which we can teach, which I don't think we're actually doing right now.
What about, to ask a naive and idealistic question, what about, does this include various kinds of recitation performance? And a friend of mine who's Swiss actually says, it's amazing in English schools, you're expected to be able to stand up and say things and recite things and maybe be in a play, but if not that, read out a poem or... and he said in Switzerland and France this is very rare, you don't, and that's why English people always sound so self-confident to foreigners, because they're taught to speak. And which he may be wrong about all that, but he was under the impression that actually this is an aspect of British education in state and private.
It used to be. I think something that's happened quite recently, well, not that recently, but I talked earlier about Michael Gove getting rid of, assessed speech at GCSE because it wasn't rigorous enough. But actually, if you look at the whole history, the kind of convoluted history of the national curriculum, there were speaking and listening targets at every key stage when it began in 1989, and what did for it was the national literacy strategy. In fact, this goes round in cycles. Every few years there's a big panic about the basics are being neglected, and what people mean by the basics in language is always reading and writing. And so you go back to putting most of your time and effort into reading and writing. You get a restructuring like the one that's taken place in reading, where it's got to be synthetic phonics, or it's got to be this and that, and there are all these tests. And so speech kind of goes out the window for a bit, and then a few years later somebody brings it back. I think we're talking at the moment about Keir Starmer's slightly throwaway remark, which has, however, led to the setting up of a commission to look into it, about how oracy had been neglected. So the neglect of speech and speaking and listening, and especially speaking, and especially public speaking, is rediscovered every few years. And there's a new initiative, and it never gets far enough. It's always sort of destroyed, within probably 10 to 15 years, because there's this panic about getting back to basics. Now, to answer the person's actual question, I think, it would be good to have structured opportunities to speak in various different ways, including performed ways and also not so performed ways in schools. And it might involve complex grammar, but it might not involve the kind of complex grammar of writing, because one of the things we know well, and it's actually a very interesting thing for kids to be language detectives about, is that the medium in which you communicate very great, and the affordances of that medium very greatly affect what its grammar is. And we can look at that for both, spoken and written forms, modes, but also the different media within that. So, how you write on, on WhatsApp is different from how you write a school essay or whatever. And speech varies considerably in style as well. So I don't think we should assume. So one of the things that's happened recently is schools instituting these policies that you have to speak the way you would write, because they're terrified that if they let people speak the way people normally speak, which is, for example, using prosody rather than sentence syntax to order and chunk up their thoughts, then they'll make mistakes when they write and get bad marks, and the school will go down in everybody's rank, in Ofsted's opinion. And so Ofsted now praises schools for insisting on things like speaking complete sentences, which are mad. So if we're going to have oracy, and I'm not against it by any means, it should be oracy that actually respects the medium that you're trying to develop people's communication skills in. There's absolutely no point using, speech to kind of practice writing on a written test, on a school-like test, because they just don't work the same way. And to my mind, one of the most important things that school pupils should learn about language, if they're going to learn about languages, is about the difference media makes, because we live so much in a kind of multimedia world, and in which they're bombarded with texts and audio of different kinds, and it would be really good if they had some idea of how that works,